Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. But we have a guest today. The guest who's been on our podcast, I think, 2 times now. So this will be the third one. Our friend Keegan. I'm convinced that Keegan is trying to, get rid of one of us, so like he can like slide in and like it'll just be the Keegan and Matt podcast. But I don't know which one. So one of us is going to end up in an accident. But that is not what
Eventually, I'll just get rid of both of you.
It'll just be the Keegan podcast.
It'll still be called Beyond Talking Points, but it'll.
Wait, are you here for a title? That's pretty good. I'm flattered.
But we're actually not going to talk about assassinations on today's episode. We're going to talk about universal basic income. So originally we were actually going to do a debate on socialism versus capitalism, but Keegan has a lot of thoughts related to UBI, and so he sent me and Matt a couple Andrew Yang videos, as well as the little pamphlet that Thomas Paine wrote called Agrarian Justice. So I don't know where the conversation's quite going to go. I'll give a few opening thoughts right here, and then pass it off to one of you. I was really interested, or should I say, I think the place I want to start this conversation is with Thomas Paine's pamphlet, because Thomas Paine was not a worldwide read or a very well-known economist. He wasn't an economist at all. He's a philosopher and a revolutionary, but he gives the theoretical background for UBI. And I was really struck by how many arguments he was giving that I've, kind of thought about or been sympathetic to over the last few years. Some of them I articulated to myself, others I didn't quite articulate. But the idea that to understand kind of like property and property rights and whatnot, or to understand kind of how we want to govern ourselves, let's say, he begins by contrasting, I guess, civilization with, kind of the noble savage. He contrasts the American colonialists who are from Europe with the Native American Indians, and he says, like, look, they don't think they own the earth. They don't really have private property in the way that we have private property. They just kind of, at some level, pull from a communal resources, and that's how they view the land and food and whatnot. But Thomas Paine doesn't say, therefore, that we need to all go back to the type of lives that Native American Indians led. He isn't as radical as Marx, for example. He's not saying, okay, get rid of private property, but he is saying that private people who own private property need to kind of pay society or pay the community some money in order to serve the communal good. And so basically what Paine says is the government should be giving everyone over a certain age a check or give everyone over a certain age a certain amount of money, so they have a certain level of living. So their standard of living is not too poor, because he is contrasting the benefits of art and science and manufacturing that's known in civilization with that this idea of kind of survival of the fittest, every man for himself. So we're giving up freedom when we join civilization, so to speak. But Paine says, therefore, that we need to kind of do something as a community to kind of gain a certain level of freedom that we lose, when we stop being in the state of nature. I know I'm being very philosophical here, but I'm just trying to lay the groundwork. But I think that's actually a good place to start. So I think I will pass the ball over to Keegan.
Yeah, that was a good summary of it. And the way Paine puts it that I think is really like succinct is that he says that, to the British poor who were living in these densely populated, oftentimes polluted cities and working long hours and, in the city life, or working long hours out, tilling the fields. The Native American's life seems like he's on a perpetual holiday. And, but meanwhile, the condition of the Native American is like abject poverty compared with the rich. And so he's basically saying that within society, within civilization, you have the potential for people to be way better off than they would have been in the state of nature, but there's also potential for them to be way worse off. And that, when you think about it, the chain of events leading to the immiseration somebody might find themselves in the present day was, it's a result of the economic game being played by a countless number of iterations over every generation, such that, when we reach Thomas Paine's day, the land is all divvied up already. And the average person can't just go out into the wilderness and live off the land if he wants to, because that land is already owned by some other nation or company or wealthy individual or what have you. And more importantly than that, Paine points out we can't really even go back to the state of nature even if we want to, because you wouldn't be able to feed everybody. And so what Paine's talking about here, it really is like deep within the liberal tradition, because he's invoking natural rights coming from a divine creator, for one. He says that it's man basically is entitled to whatever he can make with his own hands, or anything he can do, any profit he can make by improving the land with his hands, but man did not make the earth. And there's sort of the implication that there's a certain amount of the natural world and the resources of the world. Having some amount of land that you own to be able to take care of yourself is a sort of God-given right. In the same way that the framers of the Constitution talked about the God-given rights of life, liberty, and property. And so that means that the project of civilization, even though it's had these advantages and has actually elevated the lot of mankind in many ways, has also created an injustice. And so what's interesting, and why I wanted to go back to Thomas Paine to sort of talk about the first principles behind this, because Paine's way of dealing with this situation is, as Matt said, basically a system of social security and an initial sort of cash investment to every citizen that would be paid out of a sort of estate tax, that every time the generation revolves, as Paine says, you scrape a little bit off of that and then you redistribute it through the whole populace. And his idea is not that this will make everyone equal, or that it'll eliminate the meritocracy, or that there will be no more need for markets. Paine actually sees, he's still deeply in the capitalist tradition of that time, seeing the market for all of the power that it has. But his idea is basically this will make it so it'll remunerate the injustices that have been created by doing this, so that everyone will at least have a chance to make something of themselves. But he emphasizes by the end, this is not a charity, but a right that I'm talking about. This is a sort of citizen's dividend, because everyone owes a ground rent for having the exclusive use of any land that he has. And so even though Paine gives one specific way of paying for it and distributing it, we could expand from that principle even to the present day. You could still say that people owe a ground rent, or owe some sort of something back to the community for, we'll say, resources, or something that was formerly universal, but they're laying exclusive claim to. And then you could, maybe you wouldn't be paying people in pounds sterling these days, but you could adapt that based according to the plans of today. And so, I don't know, I guess I just further sort of expanded on what Paine was saying in Agrarian Justice. But before I turn it over to our NCAP Matt, I guess I'll just say this thread of argument goes through American history. I think I should bring up Henry George and Georgism, also geolibertarianism, which are related or possibly even the same thing, probably mostly the same thing in the minds of many. And Henry George more or less made very similar arguments towards the end of the 19th century as well. And so Henry George wanted, the supporters of Henry George's movement were called single taxers, because they just wanted the single tax on land and then a redistributive mechanism. And that was it. They wanted to eliminate more or less everything else. And so I guess I'll kick it over to Matt if he has any observations he wants to make about the argument.
Yeah. So I thought it was funny that Matt kind of introed his thoughts on agrarian justice by saying something along the lines of, I like all the arguments he covered, in the sense that he covered a broad swath of things, and it's a lot of things that kind of resonated to feelings you have about a lot of issues or your intuitions. Because when I kind of read through it, I had pretty much the exact opposite experience. A lot of the things that Keegan just talked about, like a lot of the appeals to how man, so in agrarian justice, as you just kind of described, they talk about agriculture, and they talked about how a lot of the difference between just land being recognizable or unrecognizable when somebody takes over is a lot of the work they do on the land. So once you have the agricultural revolution, people are, wiping out tons of natural wildlife and planting their things on it. And you can see the work they put into their land. So to some extent, there's the land that existed. And now that thing has clearly been staked out through their effort. But, he starts the pamphlet by kind of saying, before that, whose land was any of this? You kind of owe a due to civilization or humanity, because it was all humanity's land before you laid stake to it. To me, when I read that, it just sounds like a vaguely philosophical assertion. That seems kind of arbitrary to me. So I know a lot of people are going to hear that argument, and it's just going to seem like something you can gloss over. And it's like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. I mean, it was there, people showed up, people did things to the land. Who has initial ownership claims? I kind of think it's a vague assertion, and you can suss out certain ownership claims. One of my big issues with reading through the pamphlet is I think it doesn't give the due to how complex a lot of these issues are. And it's not to say I didn't live at that time, so I wasn't there on the ground experiencing it. But when we talk about the more modern conception of the debate, I think there are a lot of things that clearly are elements of income inequality or intergenerational poverty that are not resolved by this and aren't attempted to be resolved by this. And simply taking something from the top and pushing it down to the bottom with the stipend doesn't really even attempt to fix these consistent problems that are elements of other things that I think have gone wrong. So I think it almost doesn't do justice to the true problem at hand. So I'm kind of, when I read it, I think it's a lot more interesting than most arguments that are made at the time. And I think it is a good way of kind of framing certain problems, like there isn't enough property and the people who have property are all wealthy. And why are some people poorer than natives? You'd think our society could be doing better than that. And I think that is a good aspirational thing to say, but I think you could probably ask a lot more questions about why the poorest people aren't doing as well as natives. It could be a thing where a lot of people in that era there was very high birth rates. So if a lot of people stay regional, but there's really high birth rates, you're naturally going to have a shortage of something like land, right? Because you can't just make up new land in a region. It's a confined, limited thing. This is a natural thing that happens if there is scarcity. And then, unfortunately, at the time, a lot of wealth in that type of economic system is derived from doing work on land. So that means there's very high demand for land specifically. So it's these are kind of things that make sense that explain the problem. And I don't necessarily think this type of tax is in any way a real resolution to it.
Can I ask a question really quick?
Yeah, go ahead. I was pretty much done when I after that point. So.
Yeah, before we move on, I just wanted to ask, because you found the idea of basically, so I guess I would put it like this. I don't see it as Paine necessarily making an he is making an assertion that God made the earth and not man, and therefore we all are owed a common share in it, which as an atheist I don't find compelling. But I think if we were to take it and reverse it, let me just ask, I see it as Paine more just being skeptical of the claim that somebody could lay claim to a plot of land. And I guess I'm just wondering, on what basis would you say somebody could claim ownership of a plot of land?
So before you answer,
I don't necessarily think there's a good answer to that. I think one of the better answers might be because for anybody to do anything, you have to. So if nobody could stake out anything and say, this is the corner that this is the cave I'm going to sleep in and where I'm going to catch my animals and cook my food. Like, how could the caveman really act if he didn't create a little domicile in, 30,000 BC? I think it's just a necessity of what humans have to do. It more than it is something that you abstract to be beyond a certain level. I think anything else is kind of just like trying to read in a type of explanation that might not even exist. That's why I'm skeptical. So I think he's kind of like philosophizing something that is just kind of is not philosophizable. That was my intuition on the first reading. That's all.
Can you guys hear me all right? Okay. Well, I just wanted to add here, sorry for interrupting, that this reminds me, so any listeners can go back to, I don't know, 10 episodes ago or so roughly, and see the debate Matt and I had on negative and positive rights. Because, and I'm not trying to get too bogged down in the philosophical and the abstract here. We have a lot of ground to cover. But I think it's important to recognize that, I don't know, when we talk about like where rights are or where rights are founded, I don't think it's an easy conversation, and I don't necessarily think there are easy answers. Because like when I think about property rights, for example, and Matt might consider this a very basic point, easily refutable, but I don't see how property rights can exist without a group of people kind of coming together and saying, this is how we're going to divvy up the land. This is how we're going to divvy up resources. And then, if someone violates those, rules or laws or whatnot, then you visit them and say, dude, you can't do that. If you do that, we're going to beat you with sticks. We're going to take your land again. I mean, you're not following the pact, so to speak. But I realize when I say that, then someone could say, well, what about the rights you say, you claim for people to have, or are they really, grounded in human nature? Are they really grounded in nature at all? Or are rights just kind of something arbitrary that the society decides, or that the groups of people decide that they themselves have, or that or do not have, or other people do or do not have?
Well, I guess I would put it this way. I think that I could completely see the argument that maybe these rights don't exist, and maybe there's no obligation of any kind of government to provide justice or anything of that nature, that rights are just sort of a human construct, and no one deserves anything. And it's basically just a contest for power, and people took over these lands. The United States was founded by people who came in and more or less wiped out all of the original inhabitants. And now that's why it's now the land of the United States, that we then subject to a market economy and let people, buy that land or use that land. My problem with that, though, is I feel like once you're in that world, I don't know how that squares with, like, say, like the libertarian ethos. Because if we are looking at it in terms of, or just like liberalism, libertarianism, the whole idea of like the rights of man and all that, I guess what I'm saying is, like, if we're going to entertain that notion at all, I feel like we have to have a position on the question of land, and have to move past the idea of like, well, it's an unanswerable question, and how do we philosophize about it? Because if, to the extent that we do care about justice and rights and what have you, you would be forced to say, okay, a lot of the ways that land is allocated today is basically accidents of history and things that were, like, by our modern standards, like violent, expropriative. Like, I know you said the last time you don't necessarily always think in terms of the NAP, but massive violations of the NAP are what created the current distribution of land and resources. And so, like, I feel like you have to have an answer for that if you're going to say that we care about rights. And so I guess I just would like to push you more, because, like, I feel like there has to be something more.
So I think part of what muddies this conversation is the literal phrase property rights, because I think if you replace the word property rights with ownership claims and then valid ownership claims, you can somewhat show where this doesn't particularly overlap with trying to have a whole discussion of like, what does a right even mean? Because what we're really talking about here is ownership claims to land, and what is a valid ownership claim and what is not a valid ownership claim. And I think that that's how I square a lot of this stuff, because I really don't think rights are something worth squabbling about, in the sense that I think it doesn't really mean anything because so many people use certain phraseology that is almost meaningless, right? So when we did the episode on positive and negative rights, I really was only defending negative rights in the sense that the government exists. And I'm willing to say that if there is no government, you don't need freedom from government. So then you don't need negative rights, and I don't buy into positive rights. So, but if we set all that aside, and because we can agree to disagree and have that another time, if we're talking about what constitutes a valid property, a valid ownership claim on a piece of property, then you do have to suss out certain things. If somebody comes in and says, you know, your ancestors 200 years ago violently killed these people to end up here, then it's like, okay, well, is that a more valid claim on this piece of property, or is it the person who just paid $350,000 to own that property? How much do people owe for the dangerous things or violent things their ancestors have done? I would personally say they don't really owe much to that, in the sense that it's not your fault. Your ancestors of blood happened to do something that was heinous. You don't have to own up to that necessarily. I'm comfortable saying that, and I know a lot of people are uncomfortable with that.
But if you can inherit wealth, how could you not inherit like the responsibility for wealth that you stole?
Okay. I mean, I think that's an interesting question. How can you inherit wealth without inheriting liability? I guess the question is, how much wealth is a lot of people inheriting, and how much does that carry over time? And if you look at so one of the things that bothers me about the income inequality conversation is a lot of the reasons income's unequal or wealth is unequal. A lot of it breaks down in a similar way to the age distribution. So a lot of people fluctuate in wealth over their lifetime in very significant ways. And I think that's lost in the conversation about generational wealth, because a lot of people are not inheriting a lot of generational wealth. A lot of middle-class people are given enough capital to be raised effectively and to be put into a school or like a college or something like that without too much debt, given our current system. But they aren't really necessarily inheriting a house or inheriting something that's worth, an obscene amount of money. There are select people who are inheriting large estates, but that's really a small minority of the population.
I think that's the issue with income inequality, though, is it that people say there's a small minority of people who have this intergenerational wealth that's like so massive in some cases that it's very difficult to, I guess I would just put it this way, like, let's say that to make it like less abstract, let's say I decide I want to get into the grocery business. In theory, we have a free market. I go in and equally compete. But the reality is the market share is already divided up by companies who have massive means, massive amounts of wealth. Like if I want to go compete against the Walton family, there's no competition. I realistically can't, other than a series of like incredibly fortuitous things lining up for me. Just by sheer gumption alone, I don't have the resources to compete with them. And if I were to open a store and do everything right, if they decided to, they could use all of their capital to crush me. You can do things like, in certain industries, like, just undercut their price by everything $1. And we could just bleed money until, like Amazon did that to a lot of their competitors, like in the Amazon marketplace, for example. So, companies selling diapers, Amazon just like undercuts them, and then they use their in-house brand to privilege themselves. So I guess what I'm just saying is like, wealth is like a form of power. And when we don't have I think it's unrealistic to say we'll have a system where everyone can compete equally, because you can't just go in and like do reparations and redivide up all the wealth from where it is before. But there is I understand the argument that if we're going to talk in the language of rights and justice, it's very hard for me to see that I actually do have an equal opportunity, because all the power, there are immensely powerful corporations and organizations that exist today that make it very difficult they're already established, so to speak. And so I guess the reason for talking about all that is that you were talking about sort of like individual family fortunes and things of that nature, whereas I think the corporation is really the more relevant unit of what does commerce, basically.
I'm reminded, by the way, of Chomsky's comment on Adam Smith. in which he says, or at least his interpretation of Adam Smith was, he was before a free market because under conditions of perfect liberty, it leads to perfect equality. And then, as Chomsky would go on to say, and many other people who would sympathize with Chomsky and his worldview would go on to say, that there is no perfect liberty. We don't have perfect liberty, and it hasn't led to perfect equality. But I guess I just to add something really quickly before Matt responds, I kind of see maybe this goes back to my my willingness to think about human life, not only from the perspective of the individual, but the perspective of groups of people. And I think Matt would agree with me on this. Actually, there comes a point where a certain amount of wealth disparity becomes unstable. You can't, a group of people or a country or a community can't have a certain amount of a certain wealth distribution without people just rioting in the streets and just societal functions break down. So I think that we have to, someone who's, I guess, criticizing the idea that income inequality is a problem, I think has to grapple with that at the very least.
So I think I like that you brought that up, though, because I think it proves a different point. And I think the real issue, and I think that this is something that a lot of people say, but I think it's worth noting, is I think the real issue is poverty, or it's people on the very low ends of the spectrum. So the relationship between the highest and the lowest is something that can be discussed, and you can look into the associations of that. But like the thing that would cause societal instability is not that it's unequal, but it's because one of them is so bad off, right? If a lot of people were complacent and happy with what they had, even if there are very, very rich overlords, if the people on the bottom are happy, you're less likely to get a violent revolution or something of the sort.
Is that a distinction with a difference?
No. It's very important. It's very important because if you look at things like the Gini kind of coefficient and economics ways of measuring income inequality, it's about how unequal it is. It's not about how you can just look at the poverty rates instead. And then you can get something much more valuable. And then you can talk about alleviating poverty without talking about saying, oh, it's bad because some people are wealthy. I think it's very misleading. And I think it plays into certain people's political agendas because you can vilify a group. And sometimes they should be vilified, like when they're cronyist, which is most rich people in the United States. I'm okay with vilifying them. But
I'm not just saying rich people evil, by the way. That's not my argument.
I mean, I know, but I guess I'm saying I think it is worth separating out people who are in poverty from the idea of income inequality. Now, what I would say to Keegan's example of, say, like opening a grocery chain, like talk about business competition, like there are a lot of corporations that do have a lot of power. But the thing is, like if you talk about grocery chains do operate, even big ones, on very low margins. So when you had things like the coronavirus pandemic happen, there were certain jurisdictions that demanded that required certain businesses in certain areas to pay people like $3 more an hour for hazard pay. So because of that, I know there was a grocery chain in, I think, Imperial Beach or Long Beach, somewhere in California, that just immediately closed like 2 of their stores right in that area because they're like, well, even though we're a giant company, these stores are not profitable. We lose money now because even if we're a giant company, these are margin businesses. We'd be keeping them open to lose money. Why would we do that? If you can pass rules like this, we're just not going to do it. Screw that. So I think business is very complex, and I think big businesses are sometimes very dominant. Like you can talk about Amazon examples in certain product categories, but business is so complex when you talk about things that are, say, leisure. So you can talk about how like 80% of books are bought on Amazon, and then Amazon can choose not to sell certain books. But if it's an author that has a big name, they'll just sell it somewhere else, and they can still sell it. So I think it's complex when you talk about, in some way, you're kind of trying to talk about monopoly power to some extent. I think a lot more often the examples of monopoly power existing are because they are granted certain privileges by regulations that people can't keep up with. So like if you want to start a business, you have to file all sorts of things that a normal person cannot understand. And if you mess up, you will be financially penalized. So that means if you want to start a real business that's like, that the United States recognizes, you have to have a lawyer. So it's like there are all these things that are barriers to entry that exist that make these problems and exacerbate them that aren't necessarily free market capitalism in the libertarian worldview type, type issues. They aren't the reason why those things exist. So I think that's worth noting if we're talking about why competition might not exist where it should.
I get all that. I'm not, I think those are valid like responses to that issue. I think what I was more just trying to get at is that they're like, if we see it sort of like a game of Monopoly, because I know you just said business is complicated, so let me oversimplify it to a ridiculous degree. I'm not necessarily saying like inevitably we will have these anti-competitive monopolistic outcomes. I'm more just sort of saying that if you play a game of Monopoly for 20 turns, no matter where you're at, and then you introduce a new player, which that's not within the rules of Monopoly, but that's sort of like new generation coming in, the current distribution of resources is nothing that person had any control over. And you could say that was always the case, but I don't know. I think there is like that's, I guess, to bring in Paine's argument, he would argue whatever the current distribution of resources is today, that was in some way directly or indirectly a result of how the land was divided up, or the means of production, if we want to talk in Marxist terms, were divided up in the past. That then leads to the situation that people are in now. And what's interesting to me is because you kind of, I guess, to pivot a little bit, because you kind of brought this up earlier of like, okay, we could look at each individual's ownership claim and see how strong it is. Oh, you were incorrectly deprived of your property in the past, or unjustly, maybe we'll pay out some sort of reparation to you. The thing about that is that's sort of the same reasoning that like the left employs to talk about slavery reparations and reparations against the Black community. We're going to try and calculate on a sort of technocratic level how much damage was done to you and extract it and pay it back to you, to remunerate you for past sins, basically. And I think it's worth noting, Martin Luther King, for example, didn't agree with that. He argued for, again, a guaranteed minimum income in his book, 1967 book, Chaos or Community. And that was his big issue when he was assassinated, was he used the term guaranteed minimum income, but he really believed strongly this has to be universal and it has to go to everyone, because otherwise it's going to be too divisive. And he drew on some of the arguments from Thomas Paine and others. I think what's interesting and what attracted me to universal basic income is the ability to avoid all of that, of trying to like look through all of the annals of history and deal with all these problems and basically just say, look, there's going to be a flat payment on everybody, and there's going to be a flat payment to everybody. Just in terms of that allows for the main issue that he's trying to deal with is the one you were talking about earlier, poverty, less so than inequality. That helps eliminate the poverty aspect while leaving the market's dynamism and the ability to still produce, like, yes, these big inequalities. I don't know. I guess that's just sort of what I'd say, is that it's in the game of Monopoly, everybody, gets to draw their $200 every time they pass the board. And so you do get a UBI in Monopoly, and that's part of what helps keep the game stable. I guess, just to bring in that metaphor again. And so I don't know. I feel like that's the universal tax and the universal payments. I feel like kind of solves the issue of like not entering this like technocratic nightmare and trying to deal with all these problems of injustices of property claims that were violated in the past. And it deals with the issue of alleviating poverty and not making it about attacking the rich. Because it actually, in some way, if you're getting a payout from the economy and you know where that's coming from, right? You know that that's coming from the productivity of your economy. A lot of the poor might kind of like the rich in a basic income society. And there might be more of a sense of solidarity that what Elon Musk is producing, that's actually like contributing to our whole societal fund or societal well-being, or what have you. I know, I don't know if I'm being very convincing to Matt, but I guess just like to shore up some of the things you said, just kind of reminded me actually why I like UBI, because I think it avoids some of the problems that we're talking about, that normal like left-wing style welfare causes.
Yeah. So I agree with the thing I'm saying sets up somebody to try to make those claims. I just don't see it as a problem because I don't think their claims are particularly valid. Anytime I've heard people make arguments for reparations, I'm just not sympathetic. So I think it avoids that because I just don't think those are valid claims, and I don't think they'd hold up under any like real scrutiny in people's ability to trace things back. And after several generations, I just don't think there's as much modern impact as people play up. At least today, because we've had so much innovation, and I think that's kind of a valid point that we haven't talked about a lot. Is so much disruption takes place, and a lot of intergenerational wealth is lost by people being trust fund kids and not feeling the need to disrupt things. They're already wealthy. So I think on the net, a lot of those grievances would pretty much be avoided except for very out there risks. I think people are going to complain no matter what. But I mean, I agree in the sense that I think what you're saying is more politically palatable to the people with the grievances that I don't find valid. So I think you're more sympathetic to their grievances. And I think if you are sympathetic to those grievances and you know that you can't do what I'm saying that they'd want to do, that I just think they'd be avoided, blah, blah, your idea works better in that sense, if that's the political goal you want to achieve. So I'm sympathetic to that part of what you're saying. But yeah, I guess I'll leave that part there and let Matt jump in.
So I just want to make one quick point, which clarifies something I said earlier, and then I actually wanted to ask Keegan a question. So the quick point, I guess the reason I was beginning the conversation, or the reason I was talking about income inequality earlier, was not so much because I was saying like everyone has to have the equal amount of income, and we all have to be wear gray suits, to steal a Andrew Yang phrase, and just be cogs in a machine that are technically equal because no one has anything. I guess what I was meaning was systemic poverty can arise from mass income inequality. That's not to say all income inequality is necessarily bad, or you can get rid of income inequality completely. But I actually wanted to ask Keegan a question because my political trajectory has been I was very sympathetic to Bernie Sanders, and I'm still very sympathetic to him. I still think he's one of the best politicians in office right now, to trigger Matt, but and to trigger both of you, I guess. But
yeah, fuck Bernie. All my homies hate Bernie now.
So when we did the I think it was 2020. It was
Biden's best friend.
So it was for the presidential election. Yeah, it was the 2021, of course. No, it's 2016. What am I saying? I'm losing track of time. But point being, I took a presidential election test, and I told Matt this over text. I got like an 85%, I think, in terms of where I agreed with Andrew Yang. My highest was Bernie in the 90s, and I think my second highest was Tulsi. Again, I think that was in the 90s. So I'm more sympathetic, I guess, to the Bernie Sanders style type of arguments in terms of dealing with poverty and in terms of kind of the welfare programs that people like him propose. So I guess I wanted to ask, like, do you think, or does Yang think, because I'm still a little confused as to what he thinks as well about this, do you think that this UBI is a means to get rid of all social programs altogether, or is it only going to get rid of like is it going to get rid of most social programs, but you keep a few? Because I can think of at least 2 social programs off the top of my head that I don't think I would want to get rid of, even if we implemented universal basic income.
So, I mean, Yang's position on this changed kind of throughout the primary. And now that he's running for mayor, he has a whole new suite of issues. So I don't know. I mean, if he runs again, he might even have a different view in the future. But I can kind of give you what he was saying at the beginning that I feel won most people over, is that the way he put it is that we have over 126 federal welfare programs in operation right now. We spend about $600 to $800 billion a year on them. And from what we know, they're not very good at alleviating poverty. And there's a number of reasons for this. One of the reasons is the welfare trap. So for example, if you are doing Like, let's say you're getting some sort of welfare program that you can only draw if you're making less than a certain amount of money a year, like 15, let's say less than, I don't even remember what the poverty, I think it's like 17,000 a year or something like that. Shows you what I know, shows you that I'm a champagne socialist because I don't know what the poverty line is. I used to know
You and
that.
me both, brother.
But let's say, below a certain amount, 15 grand a year, we'll say, you get your welfare program and it's, let's say it's like $1,000 a month check or something like that. But let's say that if you then make above that, that all gets cut. And actually, when you look at your income, when all is said and done, you will end up making less money than you were when you were on the welfare program. And so you're incentivized to then not do better, because maybe there would be a certain point later on, a certain amount of income where you would do better. But initially, you're going to, your income's going to dive into a gulch.
Can I jump in to agree with you real quick?
Sure.
Well, one thing I like to cite when I'm arguing with Matt is I like to reference Charles Murray's book. It's not the offensive one. He has one that's much more.
Is it In Our Hands?
No. God, okay. I don't know why I'm forgetting right now. But Charles Murray wrote a kind of famous book that was it was big in like the 80s or 90s, and it was all about how all these poverty programs perpetuate poverty with bad incentives. And Charles Murray, and I will say, for this reason, has come out in favor of UBI. Because
is it coming apart, by the way?
No. What was the one? I've definitely cited it. That could be right. I read it like a year ago, and I guess that makes me forget things quick.
So the fact
but he's a backer of UBI for the reason that Keegan's saying. He's saying you don't have these traps where there's cliffs where it's like, oh, suddenly to take this $10 an hour job, you're no longer eligible for benefits that essentially pay you $7 an hour. So would you really work 40 hours a week to make $3 more an hour or something that only nets you $300 in a month? And it's like, no, of course not. I'm not stupid. So it dodges the exact problem you're laying out, and there are people who are scholars who agree with you on this point. Like that's a well-founded point, and it's very valid.
And Charles Murray, I'm glad you brought him into it, because he came out with a book, I think it's more recent, called In Our Hands, where he makes the argument for UBI, and he more or less argues for getting rid of all the programs, whereas Yang would say we should keep Social Security and a couple other things. But Murray was basically, the argument he made, I remember the way he put it at some sort of speaking function, he said was, this would be a true grand bargain, because we would be allowing you to massively increase the amount of government spending that we do for the sake of the social welfare, but you would be giving up, here he's talking the right and the left, he's speaking for the right, sort of saying to the left, you would be giving up this ability to stage manage everyone's lives that you want to have. And so that's sort of the other point about welfare is, you can end up, so like if you look at what is it, women, infants, children, WIC, the only protein you can get with WIC is peanut butter. That's literally the only thing that has protein that you can get with a WIC card. Or if you look at TANF benefits, that program is also massively restricted. And another issue, let's say that you're drawing disability. If somebody rats on you that they see you, say, volunteering in your community, let's say I'm going to go volunteer and be a little league coach. If they find out you're able-bodied, you're going to lose those disability benefits. So there's all sorts of things that people don't do, where maybe they could get a job and earn money on the side, but they don't want to lose those benefits as well. And basically what Yang's argument was that, okay, anyone who's getting less than $1,000 a month, which was his plan for the UBI, should automatically be incentivized to just drop that program, because this money is no strings attached. You don't have to fill out a form. There's no bureaucracy. That's also why it would be cheaper, because all of these other programs, and this is really the third big problem with welfare, is they're all means tested. And what that means is that you have to have a whole web of bureaucrats who's making sure no one who is actually of means is getting the welfare. So now you have to pay all those people. And a lot of these programs end up paying almost as much, if not more in some cases, to the government employees running the welfare program than they're actually paying out in welfare. And so Yang's argument that I felt you could say it's cynical, but it was very persuasive. He said that the single core competency of the federal government is cutting a bunch of checks to a lot of people. So why don't we lean into our one core competency, cut out the middleman, just send those checks straight to everybody. And so basically overnight, anyone who's getting less than $1,000 a month, all that money is just going to get rolled that we're already spending on all these programs that are not lifting people out of poverty would just get rolled into this universal fund. He proposes to pay for the rest of it with like a value-added tax and a couple other things. So he wanted to keep, as I said, like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. But the real takeaway here is these programs actually aren't good. Like, we shouldn't have them. They're not doing anything. Like we are better off. The problem is there's a liberal bias that we need to pay this money to institutional experts who will run and stage manage people's lives, and like bring them, educate them, and discipline them, and bring them out of poverty that way. And that's how you have to do it. This is the argument that no, you should just give the money directly to the people and trust that they'll. I mean, at least then at that point you can say, okay, that guy didn't lift himself out of poverty. You can't say he didn't have the means to do that. We at least gave you like a life raft, so to speak, and you didn't use it. But it's still yours. There's more power being placed in your hands than in the hands of like a bureaucrat who's deciding things for you or deciding how you can spend your money.
So, well, I asked you that question because I think I do consider myself a supporter of UBI, but I'm more of a Yang. In based on what you just said, I'm more on the Yang side of it than I am the Charles Murray side of it. Unfortunately, probably won't be able to go into as much detail about these policies as maybe you two can. But I don't think we can just get rid of all the government welfare programs, get rid of the welfare state entirely, and then say, here's $1,000, have a good day. I think there's a way of finessing a weaker social safety net, a weaker welfare state than we have now with the universal basic income. So you get the best of both worlds, but you're covering your bases as much as possible. So I don't know if anyone has anything in response to that, but that's what I was thinking.
So I think to some degree I agree with both of you guys, in the sense that I can unfortunately sound in favor of UBI because it's obviously so much better than all the broken systems we have. So everything Keegan said is stuff that I preach as a person who came from the right and as somebody who's like an ANCAP, which is often called like a right-wing libertarian. It's like all this stuff clearly doesn't work. And this is one of the currents that runs in a lot of me and Matt's conversations is it can sound like I'm only philosophically in opposition with him. But in practice, I just don't think a lot of this stuff works. So if you thought the welfare programs of the last 30 years were designed to alleviate poverty, then they clearly by no measure have been effective. And that's what you're saying, Keegan. It's like so much of this goes to waste. So much of this is essentially a jobs program for bureaucracy. And then sometimes we give somebody who needs something kind of what they want. And that's not good by anybody's measure. So obviously, if you give people just a check and they actually get to use it on stuff they want and need, then, hey, it actually works a lot better for very obvious reasons. So to that sense, like it's a marginal improvement, at least to some direction. I'm just not as convinced on things that it's a necessity. I just think if you did replace these broken systems with it, it would be better. Now, there are a lot of concerns I have that might not be as obvious to some people, that I think are worth noting. An example of which, I think this actually kind of ties in with the beginning of our conversation, is things that are less able to be produced. So if we think about poverty, it is people who are not able to meet certain needs in their life. So a lot of times if you have a homeless person, like they clearly don't have shelter, they need some place to stay, and they don't have food security, stuff like this. So fortunately, food is something that generally can be ramped up if people need more food. There's plenty of food, to feed the world probably hundreds of times over. It's just not allocated in the perfect way that keeps everybody optimally fed. In whatever way a socialist might want to define that, or in a utopian, I'm using a utopian thought experiment. Now, when we talk about things like housing, like the reason why housing is expensive in a lot of urban centers in the United States isn't only because a lot of people want to live there, it's also because there's supply constraints, right? So I know that in Philadelphia, if you want to build a house, you have to go through like an absurd amount of approvals that make this way more costly to do. And certain people can just choose to challenge it for whatever reason. And now you're out a bunch of money and you have to go through all these hoops. So imagine all these people have $12,000, especially if you have roommates, if you're in an area that's not so nice, can be a way of covering your share of the rent. Unfortunately, this doesn't fix things like the supply issue, right? So what's keeping this from just being something that's like, cool, now all the poorest people have more money and they're still chasing a supply of goods that is artificially limited. Well, then housing just costs more. Maybe types of education just cost more. Maybe things like certain low-level accesses of healthcare cost more because of these artificial constraints. This is the stuff that I think a lot of people on the left, and I'm not saying it couldn't be resolved with like a good conversation. Like if Yang was aware of this, Yang would be like, yeah, actually the zoning laws are bad in New York City. Maybe we do need to fix those if we want to actually alleviate the poor. But it's like I don't expect every major urban center to that. I don't expect them to respond to UBI by saying, suddenly we realize zoning is an issue and has been an issue for decades. So I'm concerned that people think UBI will do a lot more than it will do. And I'm worried that the unintended consequences are now you've just driven up the rent prices for the poorest people. And even though we give them all $1,000 a month, 300 of that has gone to rent increases. And it's probably better than our status quo still. I'm not disagreeing there. It's just like, these aren't going to fix the problems unless there's all sorts of other rollbacks of that are bad. So I think that's some food for thought.
Yeah. So I thought about this a lot, actually, because I think that's actually one of the advantages of it being on a federal level UBI. And Yang was asked about this a couple of times of, you should adjust that because $1,000 a month is barely anything in New York City. And Yang actually said, no, that's actually a feature. It's not a bug, because then people will maybe make the calculation, do I really want to, take this $1,000 a month in New York City where that's like a third of my rent? Or do I want to go live in a town in Missouri where this like pays for my rent and then some, pays my utilities and electricity and all that, and my cable, like there's a lot of places that are way more affordable. And he was basically saying it's actually intended that it should help those places more, because then it actually makes it more attractive to move there. And I think, especially now with the way the economy is transforming during COVID, where there's sort of like less of a desire to centralize a lot of these, what would you call it, like the white collar sort of jobs, tech jobs, things of that nature in these cities. Maybe we won't have the need for that. That might be a way of like reducing or like counteracting the trend of basically the rural areas just dying economically, and then these cities getting overcrowded and too expensive, and sort of all the problems there. I think the issue is, because Americans are at like one of the statistics Yang would cite a lot is that Americans were moving at a multi-decade low, and that rates of new business formation were also at multi-decade lows. That there were all these sort of indicators that we'd kind of like stalled out a little bit in terms of just like entrepreneurship and things like even like marriage and family formation falling, sort of this general like malaise in the culture. And that a lot of that does have to do with the fact that some of these areas, especially in the South and the Midwest, have kind of had the dynamism sucked out of them. Maybe that would, that UBI would cover your moving expenses. And it's sort of like a seed fund. Like if you are an entrepreneurial sort of person, or if you want to take risks, it gives you that little bit of like a floor under you to where, okay, if I move in with like 3 or 4 buddies, maybe we could just go in on a fixer upper and buy a house. Maybe we could go in and then buy a trailer and start our own business or something. He sort of had this vision that was actually a very positive vision of, the American spirit, that, if you want to start a small business, for example, suddenly you've got something supplementing your income while you're starting a small business, because your business isn't going to make money for the first couple of years. And then after that, your profit margins will be razor thin if you're like most small businesses. And then if people want to join you in that endeavor, it's a little less risky for them. Everyone in your community suddenly has more money to spend. So it's actually makes it a more attractive idea to, maybe open a bakery in your small town or something of that nature. And is that bakery the most capital efficient way to get muffins into people's mouths? No, it's not. Like, we can mass produce muffins, as you say. We have ways of getting goods to people that are super capital efficient. But what this does is sort of distributes a little capital power into everyone's hands as a floor. And then maybe that's not the most efficient thing to do, but it lets everyone sort of play the game. And that was sort of the idea of like getting everyone into the game to some extent. And so I don't know if that leads, if there's any reactions to that. I guess I kind of went.
There's a couple questions that I kind of came into this conversation kind of wanting to hear out what somebody has to say. And what you just said is a good springboard for it and in our conversation leading up to this. And I have a few thoughts that tie together in a way that might be a little challenging to formulate. So you got to bear with me a little bit. I guess this is the ambitious part where me and Matt try to like string together like four things that might not necessarily string together well. So Yang is making a claim that you can have like room for innovation, right? You have this floor of $12,000 a year. There are things that maybe I'm playing a two truths and a lie game where I think there's one part of his argument that I just don't think is consistent with the rest, and that might be okay. So one thing he talks about, and this is one of the typical conservative complaints is if you give everybody $1,000 a month, all they're doing to do is stay at home. You know, why would I go get a job? You give me free money. It's like a very dumb point because all of us know $1,000 a month really isn't a ton of money. But if the policy is in the name of alleviating poverty, then, you know, if you can't live off $12,000 a year, then is that really a good policy because we can't really live off it? And the people we're talking about that are on the lowest end of the spectrum, you have to think of this in the way of like the 80-20 rule of like a distributional curve. These people aren't people who are, most of the people we're talking about who are in this end of can't afford it very badly. It's not because they're like working at a bad job. It's because these are people who cannot hold a job. So these are the kinds of people who won't be able to get that supplement of the $12,000 that is necessary. So it's like, so to some degree, I'm almost like, what is the goal of the policy? There are a lot of things that we could say are broad positives about the policy, but there are some of the things where I just don't think it meets the goals, or you have to kind of argue in ways that are almost slightly different for each point that are somewhat contradictory. And I don't think that's his fault. I mean, I think that's the natural thing that occurs if you're a politician trying to get political support for a policy. But I see it as this thing where it's like, you could argue for like people will still work, but in that case, you are kind of acknowledging it's not really enough money to actually live on.
Can I interject something really quick?
Yeah. Go for it.
I'll just say, so this is the part that Yang can't say as a politician, but I think this is the truth behind why he chose that exact amount. He kind of said this, but he said it in so many words, right? The $12,000 a year, that's not enough to live on really, but you could like barely scrape by. Like if you absolutely had to like live in your fucking car and like get a gym membership so you can shower and buy fucking Cheetos at the store, that you could barely scrape by on that amount of money. Or if you're just freaking homeless and the state just gives you a card and this is how you eat or whatever. The idea is that will be so like horrible for most people. It won't be enough to like, it'll take the boot off their throat a little bit so they're not living in intolerable poverty and they're not going to commit crimes. But they'll still say my life sucks and I want to have more spending money, and that they won't have a welfare trap. Anything they add just gets added on to what they're already making.
But this might be a good transition to something that Matt was kind of saying earlier, because if you still have enough to like live in your car and shower at the gym, well, that's still, you know, that's still bad. Government still needs to do something to fix that. That's not good enough. So I think that might be where Matt might want to jump in, or I think something needs to be said, because then you're still going to have political people arguing for more, and then it doesn't really fix the problem of the welfare state to some degree. That's how I'm seeing it. I could be in my own world thinking about it that way. That's what I'm seeing.
Well, the left will never be happy, so you have to accept that. Like they'll always ask for more. So
I think I am that left that asks for more. So that's my cue. An anecdotal example though, before I jump on something else. I practically lived on $1,000 a month for a little while. Now, not exactly, because I have generous people around me that picked up, you know, a little bit here and there, but I practically lived off $1,000 for close to a year. And it was a minimalist lifestyle, and any like, you know, really nice things I had, again, came from, you know, Christmas gifts or just people being generous here and there. So it's possible to live off $1,000. It's possible to live off $1,000 is what I'm trying to say. And then the other thing I kind of wanted to say quickly, is I'm not sure. So when you bring up the conservative argument, Matt, about like, you know, if we give people $1,000, they're just going to stay on their couch all day, you know, mooching off the government. They're not contributing to society. WTF? At some level, I almost want to say to them, like, why do you care? I mean, again, I know I know the conservative talking points, so I know what the argument they're trying to say is, but at some level, it's like, well, if someone really wants to live off that $12,000, I mean, you're getting him off the street. You know, you're giving them a certain degree of freedom where at some level they can just stay in their 1-bedroom apartment and do absolutely nothing all day, and no one has to know they exist. But I mean, you're solving the poverty problem, you're solving the homelessness problem, you're giving them, again, a certain amount of capital, or a certain amount of power, economic power, to allow them to to exist. I mean, at some level, I'm kind of interested by Keegan's point about that was like kind of a devilish trick on Yang's part. He's trying to get people to work more by only giving them the barest minimum. But I don't really care, like, in terms of if people want to live off the barest minimum.
I want to interject in, I guess, an economic point, because this is an economic issue to some degree. But this is when it's the famous economics phrase, but there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? So one of the things is, like, it is awesome if 18-year-olds to 24-year-olds that are in college, they don't have to work, because I mean, I know you mentioned it, but I've definitely lived off less than $1,000 a month. Like, I didn't have an income and my rent was dirt cheap, and I just ate pasta, and I love pasta, so it's fine. There are people who could live off that, like 18 to 24-year-olds in college, and they wouldn't work. So it's like, well, the thing is, like, there are all sorts of things that would happen. So on a federal level, all the kids who get crappy jobs wouldn't necessarily feel like they had to get them. And then it's like, cool, none of them have to get the jobs that suck. But then on the other hand, what's happening right now in the labor market is a lot of people aren't going back to service industry jobs. So, well, what happens really when people don't go back to do the jobs that you and I don't want to do? Well, when they're not willing to do it, either wages go up or nobody's doing them. So going to them is a bad experience. So it's like, okay, well, now people's experiences are bad or wages go up. Well, wages going up is fine until it's not fine. So, like, wages going up in the short term is, like, great for workers, but in the long term, it might just mean, wow, we can't sustain certain business models, and now we don't have X, Y, and Z thing anymore. So, like, these are the unintended consequences in the big picture of, say, giving people money so they don't have to do crappy jobs. And now what privileged white kid in the middle class is going to take one of those kind of crappy jobs if they don't have to pay for their car? It's like, well, none of them will.
So I guess I would say that's another, I think it is an intended feature of the policy, actually. And I think that is what we're seeing right now, with a lot of people being unable to find workers at the same wages they were paying before, because they're doing the math and saying, I can get more in unemployment. But I'm just going to say, personally, I don't necessarily think that's bad either. Like you said, you don't want it to go too high. But to some extent, I think that would, if there was like that economic floor under everybody, right? Especially if, and this is another thing that Yang got basically attacked on the left, for not being for a minimum wage, especially if you eliminate the minimum wage in tandem with having a UBI, because the UBI is sort of ensuring that you have a minimum standard of income. So you don't need to tell business owners. And in fact, it actually helps create more jobs for people with that. They can, how should I put this? It makes it to where that argument that Dave Rubin used, for example, of like, well, hey, I just want to have somebody come and intern for me. Why can't I pay them $9 an hour? It becomes kind of hard on the left side to say, well, that's a horrible, unjust thing, because that person's already getting like an income of $12,000 a month. And so $40 40 hours a week, making $9 an hour on the Rubin report, you might not think that's a living wage, but hey, you combine it with this UBI and that's actually pretty good. And so meanwhile, a lot of those shitty jobs, yeah, they might have to pay people more. But I think that's a good thing. And I think it might be, and that's part of what we haven't talked about this at all. And there's differing views now in the basic income community as to whether you should bring this into the conversation, because Yang made it very central. But other people who believe the UBI for the Thomas Paine principled idea, I've heard some of them say, no, we shouldn't talk about this, but it's the idea of automation. That basically Yang's argument was, we might not actually need that many work. Like a lot of those people that you're talking about, Matt, who might just not work again and say this is fine. I think the argument is, as we automate more, we don't really need you, dude. Like we'll pay you your dividend that you can get from society, but hey, maybe you can use some of that money to go be like a TikTok streamer. And maybe now that everyone's got their UBI, all those people will have more money to give to the Patreons of TikTok. I mean, I'm kind of serious right now. Like, that's money in the middle class hands. That's spending money because it's going equally to everybody. And all of a sudden everyone has more money. It basically, it's, I guess I'll say one more thing and then hand it off. There's a UBI advocate named Scott Santens who he made the argument that what he sees money as is really, it's in today's world, post gold standard, and money representing confidence and in the consumer economy. He basically says that a government plan to redistribute money is really giving people a unit of trust. You're saying, I trust you to go out and participate in play the game of the market economy, so to speak. That it's basically just giving you skin in the game. And that with that, I guess I would argue, I would think it's true that in a nation of like 340 million people, even though you would have those number of loafers, I think people would do now a lot more creative pursuits, and there would be more of it would grow the economy for unconventional ways to make money that people are trying to do, because there'd be more spending money as well to stimulate that.
Well, okay. Well, I don't want to totally hit on you too much, but I guess the reasons why I'm not as sympathetic to that is because, like, if you look at Amazon with self-publishing, and if you look at Spotify having like easier access, or if you look at like podcasting, like all these things have exponentially grown without any of those people involved having this type of safety net. And to some degree, we have too much content. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing that people make content, but the fact is that there are all these things that are already that you can see on Amazon have 5 reviews and have like been purchased by almost nobody. And this is why I joke with Matt. We've talked about like certain types of utopian societies before, where I always joke, because I love horror movies, right? And I love horror novels. And I always joke like, well, if I got to choose my job, I'd be a horror novelist. That doesn't mean I know how to write well. It doesn't mean that I write stories that are particularly engaging, but I know that if I got to pursue something and give something like that I am most interested in, regardless of what the income is, that is what I'd pick. That's not necessarily a good thing for really anybody except for me. But I only bring that up kind of in a joking way. The other thing I wanted to bring up though is automation will replace a lot of jobs, but it is not probably in the low service sector in my imagination, because besides kiosks, most technological innovation in the last 30 years has happened in the middle class. Things like TurboTax, like, replaces accountants. It doesn't replace servers at restaurants. So I think, and I think what is more likely is things like fast casual restaurants replacing fast food restaurants, and making things that are right now, like, if people make $7 an hour there, it almost, I almost use this word in a jovial way, but it almost democratizes the experience of going to a restaurant, because people can afford to go get McDonald's. If you make every experience, every cafe can't have a quick $5 deal, because you just don't make any money off that because the labor margins, then everything is now a premium experience. And it's like, well, cool, the experience is better. The people are paid better, but who's priced out of it? And it's like, well, the poorest people are priced out of it. So I just think that's like an element that is unavoidable when you adjust these power dynamics from what they are right now. And so somebody can say, I'm okay with that, but somebody else might say, well, I kind of like just going to get crappy fast food, or just going to like the OK diner and getting like something small and cheap. And that might not be a possibility. So those people are kind of have problems. But I think that's more of just a caveat I would make to what you're saying. I don't think what a lot of you're saying is wrong. I just think these are notations, I guess, I'd add into the story that I think are relevant.
So before you answer, Keegan, I think this is a good place to. I kind of have another question, or a kind of a criticism, or at least a slight a bit of skepticism about say Andrew Yang's kind of worldview and the policies he proposes and whatnot. Because of course he talks a lot about the economics of the future, as you say. He talks a lot about automation taking away so many jobs, that cut to the point where people might not need to work, or at least fewer people will need to work, or fewer jobs will exist, jobs of certain kinds, of course. So I bring that all up just to ask the question. I mean, so this is kind of where I'm raising the kind of the socialist point maybe that you were talking about earlier, but I want a bit more of an answer for you. How do we know that UBI is really the solution for in the long run for some of the issues we're experiencing? Is it possible that Andrew Yang is kind of trying to resurrect an America that no longer exists, and is trying to kind of get us back to, the time of you had 2.5 kids and a picket fence, and on the 1950s style society where it felt like everyone was doing great economically. What if there are just issues that Yang hasn't really considered, that just say giving someone $1,000 a month isn't going to solve?
Well, okay, so first things first, I just want to get this out of the way. The really key thing to understand with UBI that's very hard to, I think, it was very hard, I'll just use myself. It was very hard for me to really grasp it, is that you're not just giving someone $1,000 a month, you're giving everyone $1,000 a month. And that has a cumulative effect that on the higher order, it has second order effects that are not just there from giving one person or a group that money. The main ones being that, sort of as I was saying before, just you having 12 grand a year isn't much, but then if you can combine with family members or close friends, maybe you can go together and buy some property or something of that nature. It kind of gives you, it works in concert with the fact that everyone else is getting it to create greater effects.
It increases the community's wealth overall, in a sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, and to speak to the socialist point, I mean, organized labor is more or less dead, but what about a built-in strike fund? I mean, that's what UBI is. Oh, okay, all of a sudden you're not getting paid at work. At least we all have our UBI. Maybe we can do our potlucks when we're striking, and that's how everyone eats. So there's a lot of things, there's a lot of second order effects of it that I would say that I think addresses the social ills a lot more than you would think. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea, like, look, no one should become a UBI advocate, like thinking that you found the magic bullet to solve all of society's ills. But the reason why people get so hyped about this policy, I think, is because they see, hold on a second. They see the failure of the current system. And the fact that we've taken this approach of trying to cater our response to all these different issues that people have and come up with like the wonky technocratic response. And what Yang pointed out that I think is just worth saying is that if we were to do a UBI in the form he suggested, that would be the single greatest act of wealth redistribution that had ever occurred in human history. I mean, we're a $20 trillion economy. So like that, the scale of wealth that you would be reintroducing to the bottom to create like what he called a trickle up economy, that would be the single biggest move you could ever make towards remedying all the things that leftists claim to care about of wealth inequality, income inequality, poverty, and all that. But yeah, like the real question is, would it be politically expedient to get that passed? But it's like, I would say, it's probably more likely to pass the UBI than establishing like a national health system. So I don't know. I think it's not a magic bullet, but I think people kind of tend to underestimate like how transformative that one policy would be if we were to like roll up a bunch of these welfare programs and introduce this new thing.
So there's one element that Keegan's brought up a lot, and it reminds me of something funny because when I brought it up to Matt, probably about a year ago at this point, to be honest, he was very upset by it, not because it's maybe because he very much disagrees with it. So this is from one of the first editions of Reason magazine. It's an article written by Lanny Friedlander. So he's the founder of Reason magazine, if I remember correctly. And he wrote an article called Welfare and Altruist Nightmare. And he was a really weird guy. He had a lot of really weird thoughts. And I bring this up only because it's really funny to read this in the conversation of UBI, because a lot of his criticisms of welfare at the beginning are pretty much about the bad incentives it creates, and UBI addresses it. But there is one criticism that I think still applies in a way that Keegan has been kind of downplaying. It's not because you're being misleading. It's just because you disagree. But I just want to note it. So I'm quoting from the article. And this is him talking about welfare, but I think it somewhat applies here. He says, instead of promoting brotherhood among men, it has split the nation into two antagonistic classes, the producers and the parasites. Such a situation precludes brotherhood. So this is something that really upset Matt, because he's upset that somebody would view welfare in such a way. But what he's getting at is, if there are some people who are like, the 80s stereotype of welfare queen or something that was, that Ronald Reagan famously said and was accused of racist, because if you have like that stereotype in your mind, the rich people or the people who are in the middle class that aren't receiving a benefit would get very upset. Well, there's something that Keegan has said that I want to push back on, because I think it is kind of a cop-out. I don't think it's intentional. So maybe it warrants explanation. But he's kind of said, it's universal. It's universal. Everybody gets $1,000. Bernie Sanders, the millionaire with all the houses, he gets $1,000. Matt, the guy who lives in the hood in North Philly, he gets $1,000. The homeless guy, $1,000. Everybody gets $1,000. Well, the thing is, like, I like to imagine that none of the three people in this conversation right now are completely dumb. And we know that the way taxes work in the United States, it is not an even tax levy. So all the rich people who get $1,000 are like, cool, I got my $1,000 check. Thank God I paid $7.6 million in taxes. And a lot of this is because we've done the biggest spending program in United States history. So none of those people are going to be happy. So even if it makes the poor people hate the rich less, I don't see how it affects the rich thinking of poor people as rubes and parasites. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe that's okay. You already said it's not a silver bullet. I just wanted to throw in the idea of union. I mean, the rich will always pretend to care for poor people, even if they don't, because it's usually in their interest, and it's usually like important for corporations to pretend like they care, even if they don't. So I guess it doesn't matter, because they'll proceed to put up the facade. But I think there is still a rift. Even like upper middle class people will probably give into the system more than they take out. That's generally a thing that has happened historically in the United States. So maybe square that circle a little bit for me. That's really the only thing I really felt was ripping me apart a few minutes ago.
So I'll say a couple. Okay, so I have like maybe a practical response to that, and then a response based on principles and intuitions that you probably will agree with less with. So the practical response is that, so somebody did an analysis and that found that basically what happens is that the way that Yang wanted to pay for this primarily was with introducing a value-added tax. A value-added tax he said half the European level, which was be 10%, but I believe he said 10 to 12%. Maybe it would scale up with certain like luxury items or specifically with tech and automation. And how a value-added tax works, which we always have to, I guess we have to go into for an American audience, because we're one of the few economies that doesn't have one. It taxes every single level of production. So, if you go to the store, you pay sales tax on a pack of playing cards, but the value-added tax comes and hits for the company that makes the cardstock. It hits when the company buys the ink. It hits when the company buys, the tape or adhesive to seal it. Every single transaction basically is taxed. And what the value-added tax ends up, it's basically what it's the tax on. It's tax on added value. So every time you add value, there's a tiny extraction. Well, not so tiny. A tenth is actually quite large. But it's a sales tax, which means in the language of the left and the progressives, it's a regressive tax. In the language of the right, you could say it's a flat tax. But more or less, it's very hard to game that tax or get out of it, which is why all the European economies like it. It was another inconsistency I noticed with the sort of Bernie wing, is that they would often talk about how look at all these things that they do in Europe that we don't wise up to here. And then Yang brought up, hey, they have a value-added tax, and that makes a lot of money, and it's very hard to get out of. And oftentimes people just say, well, that's a regressive tax. Yang wants to introduce regressive taxation. And it's like, well, if it's tied to the UBI, it's actually not regressive because it's a redistributive mechanism. So in tandem, it would not be that. But it was very funny just to see the cognitive dissonance there. But so to circle,
I would just jump in and say, I think one of the risks we're exploring here is the the idea of like Yang, who's more technocratic and actually wants it to work in practice, at least the way he perceives reality. And then you have people who were like Elizabeth Warren, who promoted a wealth tax, even though a wealth tax didn't work in Europe. A lot of places it put in a wealth tax in Europe and then abandoned it. And there were reasons why they abandoned it. So, okay, I do recognize that aspect of the value added tax. I just wanted to jump in and give that example.
Yeah, Sweden, I believe, was among the countries who abandoned it, and they're among the most progressive social democracies in Europe. So to kind of circle back to the practical realities, so somebody did a analysis of Yang's plan and basically discovered that because of how the VAT works, it's basically based on your consumption, right? So rich people will consume more, but it's not taking away from your income. So you're not feeling like you're having that taken straight away from you. And the result is that you would have to spend, I think, $190,000 a year to basically break even with the VAT and UBI, was the analysis that they did. And so obviously, if you go down from that, so somebody who's making $170,000 a year, I mean, they're not breaking even, but maybe like when they get their UBI and then they subtract everything they paid in VAT, they're only really getting like $100, right? Is basically, so it would scale like that. And then of course it would be true above that, so that when you get up to Jeff Bezos levels, the $1,000 that he gets a month in his bank account is a drop in the bucket compared to what he's paying for all the consumption that he's doing. So I guess what I would say, Matt, is like, you have to go pretty high up to get to the point where you're getting nothing from it, and you become the level where you could say they're being parasites. But even then, it's like it's still based on consumption, and to me that seems like a little bit more just, because you're not just saying that we're punishing you for being rich or earning more. It's sort of just like, it's like oxygen. It's everywhere in the economy. Everywhere you're doing business, this is just sort of the tax for the market that is flat over everything. Again, Yang still wanted to hold on to some social programs. He's obviously a Democrat, so he's not going to talk about abolishing an income tax or anything like that. But what I'm talking about here is maybe more like the Henry George idea of you could have a single tax, and that's just sort of in the oxygen of the economy. It's flat across the whole thing. But then, yeah, you could still then conceivably say, well, there are these people who are parasites. But I guess what I would say at that point is you're consuming a lot of the product output of the economy. You're going to end up funding more of the UBI. But hey, look, those poor people now have an incentive not to steal from you or violate your property rights. They're not getting the UBI when they're in jail. So they have less of an incentive to go to jail. And when they get out, they'll have more of a leg to stand on. So I don't know. I would say that's at that point, once you get to that level of wealth, what you're really, you're paying into sort of like a social insurance system, more or less. You could just see it, if you just want to see it purely that way. But what I would say on the principled level that I think would be different from your intuitions is I think there is something to, if you accept the idea that it's sort of a remuneration for the fact that somebody is worse off in the product of civilization than they would have been otherwise, sort of the Thomas Paine principle. I think somebody with very patriotic feelings, for example, might feel that it was helping them to be part of a national project. That, okay, our GDP, our total product as a civilization, that's what also we reinvest in the bottom of our civilization. And so I think there would be more of a common realization of like, oh, my neighbor across the street, me and him, we're both going to work today. There could be some people who would be cynical enough to be like, oh, now there's parasites and producers. But I think a lot more people would look around and say, all of our collective product we're producing, we are all benefiting from, and I get to see and experience in a tangible way how I benefit from it, versus now where people see their tax money get vacuumed up into a system that they very rarely, if ever, see like an actual result from. And I think that produces more resentment than anything else, is seeing like, I pay all these taxes, where does it even go?
So I wanted to jump in here quickly about the welfare point. So when you think about like the welfare state, it's very interesting because it really hasn't been around very long, and it wasn't so because of that. What am I trying to say? when it was created, I guess generally what the historians say around World War II is kind of when what we know as the modern welfare state, roughly, that's a rough estimate. You know, little bits and pieces have been added here over maybe 100 years or so to create the mass of what we know as the welfare state. And this kind of goes back to why I think someone like FDR was such a good president. You know, the welfare state, kind of similar to like basic income now, almost in a sense. Like a socialist would say, well, universal basic income is basically trying to save capitalism. But then that's basically what FDR was doing through this welfare state. He was trying to save capitalism. But then, I look at the welfare state now, especially in Europe, and I see European countries floundering. I see the welfare state crumbling under its own weight, and not too many people giving, are giving convincing arguments for why, for how we can make the welfare state better. So, I mean, in that sense, I guess I can almost see both a positive and a negative to Yang's position, because earlier I was saying like maybe he's just trying to get back to a past that's not possible, but on the other hand, maybe he would be doing something similar to what FDR did. I don't know. I just I think it would be, if we're gonna like get rid of the welfare state altogether, I guess we do need to, I guess, think about what the welfare state is doing, and if there are ways to do it better, or to take the positive aspects of it and implement them elsewhere, then we should be more than willing to have that conversation. But I don't think we should just say welfare state bad, no reason for it to exist, poor people or parasites.
Well, now I'm realizing, as you say this, that I think I'm convinced that the UBI is a better way of doing the welfare state, for a lot of reasons. And for that reason, Matt just reminded me that's why in my closing point right now, I'm going to come out against UBI absolutely, because you said that all of his plans were to keep capitalism alive. You meant that it was state capitalism is kept alive by these garbage welfare policies. Since I hate state capitalism and the state with every bone in my body, I need these things to keep going in the worst way possible. That's actually why, though, I don't think UBI will be politically palatable. Because unless they do policies in the worst way possible, then it's not really the state doing it, right? The state always chooses to enact it in this garbage way, like how Lyndon Johnson expanded it in such a bad way. And as interesting as UBI is it's interesting because it's saying, what if the state actually did this good? What would it look like? And that's not how it plays out. So in one sense, for the short term, like, I guess that'd be better. On the other hand, I mean, I can't wait till state capitalism implodes. So it will continue to be doing what the welfare state is doing now, which is wasting tons of taxpayer money and making, fueling right-wing movements every 10 years and so forth. So that's the optimistic thoughts I wanted to end on before I let Keegan and Matt wrap up, and then I'll sign us off when you guys are done. But I promise I won't interlude at all, so you guys can talk about how much you love FDR as much as you want, and I will promise not to say anything other than I hate his guts and I wish polio killed him faster.
If you do, I'll just mute you. So.
Well, should I go first with final thoughts, Matt? Okay. Yeah. Well, first I'll just quote one of the fathers of neoconservatism, James Burnham, who said in the book The Managerial Revolution that basically during World War II, what was emerging was not just like socialism or fascism, but a general view that some sort of managerial sect should run the world. And welfare had its good aspects from my perspective, but it was part of that managerial revolution that's been sort of lingering and festering in the background of our society and has gotten really out of control and become like a bureaucratic dual state at this point. And so I think you're right, Matt, that's the reason why Yang will not ever be allowed to implement that is because it would threaten that managerial power. And more importantly, from the other side of things, because I don't want to just give the state, some shots. I'll take some shots at private corporations. I mean, in the same way you're talking about how the state, UBI is sort of like this idealistic version of how the state could do things, but it doesn't work out that way. I think you could say the same thing about a lot of the private sector. And I guess, I don't know, I would put it like this. If you set the precedent that you can do something like UBI, if you set the precedent that, yeah, you can just be paid, we can just redistribute the wealth and have this continually replenishing fund for you, that gets the, again, as I was saying in the beginning, that changes people's mindset and gets the boot off their throat for a little bit, to where they might not take that job. They might be able to organize a strike better. They might be able to come together and purchase some property. And I think for that reason, the corporate donors don't want this to happen either. The social managers don't want to give up their power. The corporate donors of the megacorps, what you would call a crony capitalist, but basically just this state capitalist machine, they don't want to give, they don't want you to go form your own co-op. They want you to work for their Amazon warehouse. And so that's the opposition to this. But I think this is also, and I guess this will be my final thought, this is why I think the Bernie left really lost the plot with Yang. Because to me, what's important is, like I don't necessarily take the accelerationist approach that you do, but I like when people introduce ideas that subvert the current paradigm and get people to think, hey, maybe something is possible that is totally outside of what our current system is, or that would transform the system in such a way that, like, this current system that we have set up is a choice, and that we could organize society in a way that would change some of those fundamental underlying assumptions. And that's what I really liked about Yang's campaign more than anything. And I think what the Bernie people never understood is that's what he was kind of aiming for with UBI, with both the prospect of implementing it, but even just talking about it and changing people's mind on it, was I think that had more of a transformative effect than Bernie Sanders, who is, as Slavoj Žižek says, an old moralistic dinosaur who is up there talking. I think he was really more the one trying to just say, we'll recapture the way things used to be, and we'll just do that by fiat. The government's just going to say that we're going to get union membership back up by offering you a federal union job at $15 an hour or whatever the hell, where we're going to manage and control all of it. And so that's what I liked about the Yang option, I guess, is the idea of, still by libertarian standards, massive amount of spending and massive big government, but it's channeled in a way towards making it more of your choice, how you run your life with it, at least in the idealistic form that will probably never happen.
Well, just to be clear, I want to set the historical record straight for the historians 1,000 years from now, uncovering this podcast and listening to it. I, being a Bernie supporter myself, I am exempt from this charge of not getting Yang correct. I like I said in earlier on the podcast, I've always thought that both of them have really important ideas. They both have important roles to play. I see them both as allies. I see them as they're just fighting they're almost fighting the same battles on different fronts and with slightly different means. So I don't really have any qualms or any problems with saying, I am or was a Bernie supporter, and I still see that overall, I think I'm more pro UBI than I am anti UBI. But of course, at some level, what Andrew Yang, I guess the reason I was like kind of asking you earlier, like, why is Andrew Yang really thinking about the future, or is he thinking more about the past? Because it's quite interesting to if you think about Yang, I guess, as a cultural phenomenon. I mean, he's really trying to fulfill the American dream, and I'm glad you also brought up you showed us that Thomas Paine pamphlet, because that shows this side of the American Revolution and American history and American politics, which isn't often talked about. The Thomas Paine type side of things was kind of swept under the rug, and it's still there, and it has an influence sometimes, but it's not really in the mainstream political dialogue. So, I mean, someone like Thomas Paine wasn't necessarily a Marxist, but that doesn't mean he wasn't, really radical. It's kind of crazy at some level. I mean, people today, or some people today would say universal basic income is kind of this radical idea. And Thomas Paine talking about it in the 1790s. I mean, how insane is that? How far? I mean, he was really ahead of his time. and Yang might also be ahead of his time. I think that's my piece said.
Oh, just really quick, I don't have bad blood at Bernie because of anything in the election. I just think he shouldn't have fucking voted for the CARES Act. Fuck that dude.
And I'll echo Keegan. I don't have anything against Bernie. I just think he should be put up against a wall and eliminated. Okay.
See, Matt, this is why we can't have guests.
You had your last word, so I got to make my Bernie deserves to die joke and sign us off. Okay, it's in the contract. You can look at it. We can have our well, actually, in our labor contract, you do have to, it's arbitration, so I'm going to win.
But you destroyed my brilliant plan to have Noam Chomsky on the podcast when you said he should be shot. So
I definitely, you're not wrong. Well, and if you want to, and this is a smooth transition, if you want to listen to the episode where I said Noam Chomsky should be put up against one shot, I want to say that's the one when we talked about January 6th. So if you come through the archives, it's something like that if you go a few months back. But you can find all past episodes of Beyond Talking Points, where we've also talked to Keegan, our lovely guest, 2 other times on all sorts of issues. And he always brings a great, insightful voice. And I can't say enough how much I appreciate having him on. But you can find all our past episodes on our podcast feed, on our YouTube channel, and you can hear us rant and rave about all sorts of things. You can find me by searching the Obey podcast, where I do a solo podcast where I rant about all sorts of things that are in the news. I've been really trying to do deep dives, which means I have to research, which has really stunted me putting out content. But I'm hoping to do some long kind of deep dives into stuff that I'm seeing. I realize there's a niche of think tanks saying kind of outrageous things that nobody talks about, and not a lot of people talk about those. So I'm trying to look more into that and maybe bring that kind of content. So if you're interested in that, pay attention to that feed, and I'll be putting out stuff in the near future. You can find Matt's stuff as the Anti-Philosopher on YouTube, where he does vlogs and other stuff like that. He provides commentary on other things that I don't want to talk about, because I'm a simple-minded anarchist that doesn't want to talk about things like literature and philosophy, because I'm an uneducated caveman to some degree. Keegan, do you want to talk to us about where we can find more of your stuff?
Live in a pod and eat bugs. That's the future. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. You can find me at EssentialSalts on YouTube.
Okay, EssentialSalts on YouTube, and I'm under the impression you do live streams every now and then.
Yeah, I might not do that much in the future, because I think I've realized it'll be less frequent. I think I'm gonna maybe try and back off until I grow more like subscribers. But doing weirdo fucking niche shit like that we talk about, it's so I just do it to do it. So
exactly.
I just want to say, Keegan, though, if you want to. If you're correct, or if you're truly committed to your earlier statement, you should listen to our episode on anarcho-primitivism, where we destroy you with facts and logic.
Okay.
You're not actually.
Okay.
He's not actually an anarcho-primitivist, folks. But
totally. But you can find Keegan's stuff at EssentialSalts on YouTube, where he has done more conversations about politics, and he is you definitely bring a good light to things. You brought up stuff that I've never heard of, so it's fun hearing from voices like that, because a lot of people are in their bubbles. But for now, we're leaving the UBI conversation at that and sign off for now. It's Matt, and Keegan. Thank you.